Welcome to the Me, You and Data Podcast, the podcast that uncovers insights from leading data science and analytics professionals globally to enable you to grow your career, teams and business. I'm Joseph Carla, your host and founder at 633 who bring you this podcast. We hope you get value from this episode. Hello everyone and welcome to the Me, You and Data Podcast. I'm thrilled to be joined by Jo Gordan, who I've known for quite a while. And Jo is the founder of Jo Gordan Consulting and has extensive experience across media agencies and in the marketing and analytics world. So Jo, do you want to give the listeners and viewers a bit of a deeper background into who you are and what you're doing now?
Yeah, so I'm, I guess, a bit of an old kid on the block. I've got 21 years experience and I started my first role in 1999 in London. As you said, I worked for a number of marketing analytics teams, mainly within media agencies, although towards the end of my employed career, I also worked client side. I left the corporate world to go freelance in the middle of 2017. And the main reason for that really was that my husband and I moved away from London. So we called it Project Move. It was Life 2.0. And the general idea was to build a career around life rather than the other way around.
Yeah. And this podcast is going to be very different to the other podcasts that I've done so far, and I'm really excited about it because I remember speaking to you when you was making that transition at the start all those years ago, and it was such a breath of fresh air, you know, to see someone who was going to do what it is that they wanted to do, and do it in a way that I've never really seen done before, especially at your level of seniority, you know, but you was really kind of going to grab things by the scruff of the neck and do it. So do you want to, I guess, give us a bit more of an understanding of how that was? Because I think that there's a lot of people who would like to make that transition, you know, into kind of doing something that they are more passionate about. So what was that transition like from corporate to your own business and this new life, and how did you kind of define who you were in this new reality?
Yeah, so I'd like to say that there was a grand master plan, but like many people in my position, the business that I've got now developed quite organically. So initially, it's probably worth saying that when I left my last corporate role, I had no intention of ever working in the same industry again. Now, that makes it sound as if I was really, really disillusioned, and that's not really the case. But what I didn't think I was going to be able to do at that time was still do the parts of, you know, data and analytics that I loved, but kind of be able to sidestep the bits of my corporate roles that I either didn't enjoy or I felt like that I was struggling with. So my initial intention was to actually walk away and retrain in a completely different career. But I guess fate stepped in and our relocation took 6 months rather than 2 months. And in that time, I was offered by some old contacts a couple of short contract roles back within media agencies. Not ones I'd ever been employed by, but I know quite a lot of people in my network. And so that got me thinking about whether it was possible for me to continue to do paid work and make my living that way, still doing what I loved. And so I started to explore, you know, the opportunities to work back in my old environment initially, but on a freelance basis.
Yeah.
And I continued to do that for about a year and then decided to set up a company to do that through.
Yeah, And you speak about obviously doing what you love. For the listeners who obviously don't know what you're passionate about, do you mind going into a bit of insight? Because I think that there's a lot of people who have things outside of work that they're passionate about, and you've managed to build a business around that as well. So it seems as though, yeah.
So if we go way back to my childhood, I've always been really numerate. And when I initially applied for graduate jobs, I was applying to banking or finance, not realizing actually that I probably was entirely unsuited to that kind of career. Because although I'm very numerate, I'm not very interested in some of those classic numbers industries like banking or finance. So when I landed in advertising, that was the icing on the cake for me. I got to play in Excel and get trained up in econometrics, which is still what I do for a majority of my paid work, but doing it in the context of watching adverts and stuff like that and working out, what the return on investment is for advertising across different channels. And that's basically the crux of what econometrics is. So the elements that I really enjoy and I'm passionate about are actually handling the data. And yes, there's a kind of process, and econometrics is a kind of advanced analytics technique, but it's actually about problem solving. And so whatever business I'm working with these days, that's the part that I really enjoy, which is, understanding what the business challenges are for a particular client and using my skills and expertise in data handling and modeling to be able to help them answer those questions.
Yeah. And moving from corporate to obviously running your own business and working on a freelance basis and setting up your business, what challenges did you face? Because I'm sure that it wasn't like as straightforward as like 1, 2, 3, let's say. So were there any challenges, and I guess how did you overcome that?
So I guess now, with the benefit of kind of 3.5 years hindsight, I would say that I've got 3 different types of clients that I work with. So one of them would be contracting back for the agencies that I used to work with. And so I would tend to go in on an interim basis and be a part of a larger team. I also would do a similar type of work for smaller businesses that don't have in-house analytics teams or use media agencies. And so again, that is still doing econometrics or marketing mix modeling, but working directly with a business rather than being attached to an agency. And then I also work with other freelancers as well who put together freelance teams, and that's a mixture of, sometimes it's econometrics and sometimes it's just more general data work.
Yeah, so in trying to do that type of work, because I'm thinking that there may be people who, even setting up and going into a freelance type opportunity from corporate, there's maybe some fears that they have. Were there any fears your side? And what type of advice would you give to someone who is looking to make the jump but is maybe on the fence a little bit?
So one of the challenges I actually faced going back to work within agencies is that because I am very experienced, there were some initial reservations on the agency side about hiring someone who was much more experienced than the person that they were going to be reporting into. And I think that, you kind of just need to try it and see whether it's a good fit. But because I really enjoy the hands-on side of analysis, their fears were unfounded. They were kind of worried that I would get a bit bored doing the hands-on work, when actually that's the part that I really enjoy. But the added benefit is that because I've been in a lot of different agency positions, I understand the pressures that different people within the agency are facing, and so that I can start to alleviate those pressures. So I become a little bit more of a value added than just hiring hands to do analysis.
Yeah.
And then it's a completely different kettle of fish working with businesses who are not necessarily used to using marketing jargon and because they don't have a media agency. So one of the things about the SME space is that you can have very, very small businesses like mine, where they're kind of founder run. But the largest SMEs are actually multi-million pound businesses, but they don't necessarily use any of the language that I am used to using. So I had to completely adopt kind of a new vocabulary for my own marketing, but also when I'm liaising with those types of clients.
Yeah. And you touch on an important point, because there is, a lot of value that SMEs and founder-led businesses like yourself can actually add to not only larger companies, but also other kind of small to medium-sized enterprises as well. What are some other benefits, I guess, of that you've seen your clients benefit from in using you, as opposed to, let's say, using a larger or massive agency?
I think there's a lot of businesses out there that, because they don't employ anyone within their business who has a data background, or they may not even have a marketing department, they're not necessarily aware that some of these services and approaches exist. So they still have similar questions to the very big corporate companies that I would work with if I was interim in an agency, but they're just not aware that there are solutions to those problems. Whereas if you work with a large consumer brand, they will probably come to you and ask for a solution. They're probably aware of what marketing mix modeling or econometrics is, even though they might not know exactly how it works.
Yeah.
Whereas there's a lot of businesses, I think, that are not even aware that data specialists exist. So that's one challenge. And then I think another challenge is, another opportunity is that it's not all or nothing. So a lot of businesses, I think, don't think in terms of data or modeling, because in their mind, they're too small to be going for that kind of solution. Whereas they're not necessarily aware that they can employ a freelancer on an on-demand basis as and when they have issues to solve.
Yeah.
It's kind of a halfway house between needing to employ someone full-time, which they probably don't need to do, and they're not aware that they can, hire resources on demand like me.
Yeah, no, those are good points. And I guess that it isn't a one size fits all, and someone like yourself is able to be flexible and answer different questions, and also ask different businesses different questions that they didn't know that needed to be asked. So that's a good point. And I've known you for a while, Jo, and always speaking to you, and in terms of the roles and levels of seniority that you've had, head of marketing effectiveness, director level, and also based on your activity on LinkedIn as well, you wouldn't necessarily think that, you're a introvert, let's say. So, and that's something that you take pride in and have actually made your superpower. So do you mind just giving us a bit of insight into why you feel you're an introvert, and I guess how that has played out in your career?
Yeah. So introversion sometimes gets kind of confused with shyness.
Agreed.
And so I am an introvert, and I'm also shy as well. I think having such a long corporate career has meant that I can get by in situations that would naturally make me feel uncomfortable. And I say uncomfortable because that's the shyness. So being able to stand up in a boardroom and present to, marketing directors or the chief marketing officer. I've done that because that was part of my job. It's not necessarily something that I would have chosen to do given half the chance. Introversion is more about where I get my energy from, and I get much more energy and enthusiasm from actually working alone and being on my own for long periods of time. And I find that being within groups, particularly large groups of people, is quite draining. Now, that can be a problem when you run your own business because you have to get out there and put yourself out there. The fact that most business now at the moment is conducted online, I've taken advantage of, because I find speaking online is less uncomfortable for me than meeting people face to face. So I've made sure that I've done an awful lot of that over the last year or so. And I you said, turned it into my superpower. Over the last couple of years, I've read up a lot on introversion, and there's a very, very good book by someone called Susan Cain called Quiet. And it's very, very in depth. And it's suitable for introverts, but also people who live with introverts, to understand the way they think. And once I'd read that book, several things started to click into place, and I realized why I had struggled with some things in my corporate career, because you can change your personality and your behavior to a certain extent, but not completely. But you can also see the opportunities in what you are most comfortable in. And so one of the things that people need if they hire a freelancer is they often hire a freelancer because they're short of time. So the fact that I like spending long periods of time figuring stuff out on my own and working autonomously fits hand in glove with, being that kind of resource to a client.
Yeah. And that's obviously something that, has worked out quite well for you, and you have prioritized, working in a way that's most comfortable for yourself over anything else, which I think is fantastic. And I think that a lot of people kind of want to find that ideal spot of essentially doing what they want, how they want to do it. Was there any fear or kind of second thoughts in how you was going to make that happen? Because obviously you mentioned that, working in corporate, you had to do things because you had to do things. But like, how did you, overcome that fear, if there was any, of, okay, how am I actually going to make this work now that I'm working for myself?
Okay, so one thing that doesn't happen is you can't just sit there and wait for the phone to ring, because it won't. You kind of have to get out there. And I think what I've tried to do is, even though it's not, because I know it's not something that I would, that's always top of my list to do, I make sure that I book things like networking in advance, and I just make them a habit. So if you regularly do something, you can make it part of your routine, and then you almost forget that you don't like doing it because you've normalized it. And so I make a habit of doing the parts of my job that are less enjoyable for me personally at the beginning of the day, just to get them done. That's
a good technique. I think it's sometimes referred to as eating the frog.
Yes.
So getting it out of the way early doors. And like, that kind of brings you on to another topic. Obviously, you sort of eat what you kill, to put it crudely, as a freelancer. What has been your approach to sales and, getting new work? And you mentioned obviously networking being a part of that. What else have you used?
So I am very active on LinkedIn, and I actually probably get, in one way or another, 90% of my work through LinkedIn. And I operate an inbound strategy, so I don't ever message and pitch people. All of the work that I've got has been from either posting regularly, so I become top of mind to a very old connection. So one of the pieces of work that I got last year was from a connection. It was a referral from a connection that I'd not spoken to for 10 years.
Wow.
And so, I hear lots of people talking about culling their connections on LinkedIn. Don't.
Yeah.
Unfollow people, but don't cut that connection, because you never know. But also, I've won business from people that I don't, haven't had a relationship with, that have just seen things that I've posted and reached out to me asking for more information.
Yeah.
And, I've tested out all of the major social media platforms in that way, and just gone back to the two that work the best for me. And so I think
Which are, sorry, Jo? So the two
LinkedIn,
that work the best for you.
Yeah, LinkedIn and Twitter. I won a business competition on Twitter, and as a consequence, I have a very large audience on Twitter. Although one of the things on my list to do is to learn how to use it better and more effectively this year.
Yeah. Okay.
The other thing that I do is blog. So I write, and that is moving my website up in the organic rankings. So since I've started blogging regularly. So my website is never going to be something that gets me a lot of business directly. But when I write, it helps me formulate my own thoughts and find better ways to explain things to people. But it's also good for organic SEO as well.
Yeah. And that's really good to know, because it does work, right? Inbound definitely works. And a question, because I actually know someone also in the agency world, an econometrician, who is thinking about making the jump. And for her, there was an anxiety around, where's the next job going to come from, or where's the next piece of work going to come from. So for you, and using that inbound strategy, it's slightly hard to measure sometimes, isn't it?
Yeah.
Is there ever an anxiety around, okay, I'm doing all of this inbound, but how do I know that it's going to, or because you don't necessarily know when. So how do you cope with that, if that's ever something that you've had to cope with?
Yeah, so it can be quite, income can be quite lumpy. So I think you kind of need to make a decision in terms of a business model about whether you're going to go for smaller jobs and multiple jobs at once. Then I think it's easier to keep income coming in more quickly, but you've also got a much faster turnaround time. So it can be tricky then to keep that pipeline full. Or I've made the decision to work pretty much with one client at a time, but on much bigger engagements. And so the benefit of that is that it can be more financially lucrative. So the commercials are better, but you don't necessarily get paid very often. So that's something, that you need to plan for. And it can be hard to get the timing of those jobs right if you're in a position where you need to kind of have work back to back throughout the whole year. Because the bigger contracts, you're not really in control of when they start and end. It can be tricky, but not impossible.
And you mentioned what I think is an important thing around, understanding what your business model is, and like defining to an extent that value proposition and who you are in the business world. So with regards to clients and stuff, because sometimes people do tend to put themselves in a bit of a box of, okay, I'm only going to work with large corporates, or I'm only going to work with SMEs. What has been your approach, and can you explain to people what that looks like for you, and I guess why it doesn't necessarily have to be one or the other?
The way that I like to structure my financial year, if I can, is to take one or two agency contracts which would typically be for about 3 months, 3 or 4 months at a time, and be full time, so pretty full on. And even though you're working on a freelance basis, because of the time commitment, even though you don't have the time to do anything else, unless you were prepared to work on the weekends on some smaller jobs. That's not something that I've needed to do, so I haven't done. And then I'd like to put gaps between those bigger jobs. I think the last year or so has been an exception because of the uncertainty. I've kind of deviated away from what I ideally want and just taken work when it's come in. But then I would like to fill those gaps with smaller pieces of work with businesses that, in industries that I've not worked with before. So almost cherry picking opportunities that are completely new. Because the agency work is very interesting, but it is quite close to what I used to do in my corporate career. And from a learning perspective, I'm learning a lot more new things from working with different kinds of businesses.
Yeah. And you've prioritized happiness and personal satisfaction as well, on top of obviously doing the stuff that you love to do at work. For some of the stuff that you usually do, such as being on site and volunteering at schools and stuff like that, how has that changed in this kind of new normal that we find ourselves in? And how have you pivoted to still kind of ensure that your cup is full in that area?
Yeah, so I usually only work the equivalent of 4 days paid work a week. Now, I might spread that over 5, depending on what the job is, but I would always take time out during the week, usually, to do shifts in the hospice or go and read with 5-year-olds in a school. And they are both totally different to the paid work, and also give me, I was starting to develop new skills. Those have both been on hold since last March, and there's really no sign of when they're going to be coming back online. So for part of last year, I took on more paid work, just in case there was a kind of a prolonged downturn this year. So I sort of banked a bit more than I was planning to last year. But also now what I've done is, one of the charities that I'm involved with, I've started to, because I can't work on the front line, I've started to support the board of directors using some of my kind of data skills and writing skills and stuff like that. Yeah.
It's been an interesting year last year, but this year's definitely hopefully looking up, and with the vaccine, it seems as though there's some light at the end of the tunnel. But what are you most excited about this year in the world of like econometrics, or even in the short to medium term in the world of data and econometrics?
Well, I think that and it's always been the case, when business is good, companies of all sizes are less interested in finding out what worked and what didn't, because they don't, business is good. When business hits harder times, all of a sudden, there's a demand to find out how you can save money, or what activities can I cut that are not working to save me some money, or I really, really need to reach this goal. What is the quickest way I'm going to get there? I think the interesting thing right now versus other periods of recession is the pandemic has hit almost all businesses in a way that we've not seen before. Now, some have obviously started to recover and others haven't. I've already modeled the first lockdown period with one client, and I'm kind of involved in something similar right now, in some work I'm doing at the moment. So there is a demand there to understand the speed of recovery. People have got, I think a lot of businesses have got more financial constraints than usual. So there's going to be more interest in techniques that can disentangle complicated marketing plans. Yeah. And also there's a group of businesses that haven't been able to market for a while. So they're going to want to get a jump on their competitors and be ready for when they can open again. So there, I guess I'm particularly thinking about hospitality and some of the brands that service that industry.
Yeah, fantastic. And to kind of round up what you said there, there's always opportunity in crisis. There's always opportunity like in a downturn, and businesses are going to start to look at what that opportunity looks like so that they can continue to thrive and not just survive. So I totally agree with you on that. And career-wise, Jo, what has been the best piece of advice that you've received in your career? I know that's usually a tough question, but you can give me one or two nuggets if you feel like it.
Yeah, there is one that springs to mind, and it was years and years ago now, but I've never forgotten it. And it was in my first job, and I guess it was around the time that I was starting to move into management, away from just being a member of a team. And one of my managers said to me, "You're not paid to be liked." And that sounds really, really stark. And it puzzled me for a little while. What it doesn't mean, after I've thought about it for a long time, it doesn't mean that it give you license to behave in a way that's kind of rude to others when you reach kind of management and leadership levels. Yeah. I think sometimes that happens unintentionally, but in some industries, the career path is to move from doing to managing to leading. And if you're the best doer in the world at something, it doesn't necessarily make you the best manager or the best leader. Those are different, very different types of skills. I think that comment that was made to me has more to do with, you can kind of paraphrase it as, don't confuse respect with being liked. So I would say that it's respect is what you need to foster, whether you're employed or whether you're running a business. And what I've found, especially since I've been running a business, is that respect leads to trust. And trust is what's going to get you repeat business from clients. And repeat business is absolute gold if you run a business. And one of the things that has got me respect is being really honest. So I did a blog a few days ago about my company values, and I talk about honesty in that, and how being honest sometimes has got me into hot water, but in the long run, it's the one value that's taken my business the furthest.
Yeah, that's fantastic advice. And respect leading to trust, and trust in your own business and internally in a corporate business also fosters an environment, where people feel comfortable, people are motivated, people feel like they can give that extra bit more as well. So I think that's really good advice, and you took it in the right way, and it's obviously reaped a lot of reward. So thank you so much for your time today, Jo. I think that this podcast is going to be highly useful to a lot of people. I think it's one of those that it's going to be the podcast that people didn't know they needed. But I really appreciate all of the value that you've added, and I look forward to releasing it. So thanks again, Jo.
Absolute pleasure.